The small brown fragment sits behind glass, its surface broken into tiny fibers, where the ancient parchment has survived more than 2,000 years. The writing is cramped. Black ink runs across the damaged skin in short lines, with gaps where the material has disappeared. This is not a modern copy. It is one of the Aramaic fragments of 1st Enoch, recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the group associated with Cave 4 at Qumran. One of those manuscripts, 4Q201, was copied around 200 to 150 BCE. The Book of Enoch was not simply forgotten. It was excluded from most Jewish and Christian biblical canons. There was no single ancient council that officially banned every copy of Enoch, and that distinction matters. What happened was more complicated. The work remained preserved in some traditions, while disappearing from most Western biblical collections. In Ethiopia and Eritrea, 1 Enoch remained part of the biblical canon. Elsewhere, it became an ancient text outside the Standard Bible. Then the fragments came out of the caves. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the status of Enoch almost overnight for modern scholars. What had survived in complete form, primarily through the ancient Ethiopic tradition, could now be compared with much older Aramaic witnesses. The original Aramaic material had not simply vanished. Pieces of it were still there. And those pieces are important because they tell us exactly what Enoch does describe. Not a genetic laboratory, not a modern DNA sequence. A text about human corruption, heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, judgment, cosmic order, and generations descending from earlier generations. The central claim examined here is simple. 1 Enoch contains language about corrupted human generations and inherited consequences, but the surviving evidence does not reveal a hidden biological gene that skips bloodlines every few generations. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the Enoch manuscripts actually contain, what later readers have connected to heredity, what modern genetics can genuinely tell us about traits appearing or disappearing across generations, and why the difference between an ancient description of lineage and a genetic mechanism is more important than it first appears. If ancient texts that seem to anticipate modern questions fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from scripture, history, and records. But here's what makes this stranger. The oldest surviving witnesses do not come from a medieval imagination. They come from the Second Temple period. The Library of Congress records 4Q201 as an Aramaic Enoch manuscript copied approximately between 200 and 150 BCE. The fragment is part of the material recovered from Qumran Cave 4. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve several Enoch manuscripts, giving scholars multiple pieces of the ancient textual tradition rather than a single late copy. And the scholarly work on those fragments is extensive. George W. E. Nicholsberg and James C. Vanderkam produced the Hermania translation of 1 Enoch in 2012, incorporating the Ethiopic text, Greek witnesses, and the Dead Sea Aramaic fragments. Vanderkam's work with the Oxford Handbook of the Dead Sea Scrolls describes 1 Enoch not as one document written at one moment, but as a collection of ancient booklets composed at different times, with most of the material originally written in Aramaic. That point changes how you read the title of this video. There is no single manuscript called the Gene Manuscript. There is no Enoch chapter containing a DNA sequence. There is no ancient passage that identifies a chromosome, a mutation, or a hereditary allele. What there is, however, is repeated concern with generations, lineage, human descent, the consequences of what one generation does to another. And that is where the modern comparison begins. And this is where it gets disturbing. Not because Enoch secretly describes molecular genetics, because some of the language is close enough to questions we now ask about inheritance, that it becomes easy to cross a line from interpretation into invention. What we're looking at breaks into 5 parts. Part 1 is the Book of the Watchers. In 1 Enoch, chapters 1 through 36, Enoch describes a world in which heavenly beings descend and interact with human women. The Watchers take wives. They produce offspring. The resulting giants become central to the account. The text then describes violence spreading through the earth and connects the corruption of the human world with what these beings have done. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran preserve portions of this material, including passages concerning the Watchers, their teachings, their offspring, and their punishment. The important word here is offspring. The text is concerned with reproduction. It is concerned with the crossing of categories, and it is concerned with consequences extending beyond the immediate act. But that still does not mean genetics. Part 2 is the astronomical book. In chapters 72 through 82, the focus shifts away from the Watchers and toward the movements of the sun, moon, stars, winds, and calendar. The material is highly structured. It presents heavenly cycles as ordered systems. The point is not a biological inheritance mechanism. The point is cosmic regularity. This matters because later readers sometimes take any repeated pattern in an ancient text and interpret it as encoded scientific knowledge. That is not how evidence works. A pattern is not automatically a prediction. Part 3 is the animal apocalypse. In chapters 83 through 90, human history is represented through animals. Different groups and figures appear under symbolic forms. Generations move through historical periods. The text describes conflict, judgment, and eventual restoration. Again, lineage matters. But the text is dealing with moral and historical identity, not molecular inheritance. Part 4 is the Epistle of Enoch. In chapters 91 through 108, the text contains warnings, directed toward generations, and describes the consequences of wickedness and righteousness. One of its recurring concerns is what happens to descendants and how human behavior unfolds across time. This is the section that can sound surprisingly modern when read through the lens of heredity. But the ancient framework is not the framework of a genetics laboratory. Part 5 is the dream visions and related judgment material. Here, the repeated movement of generations becomes part of a much larger chronological structure. Human beings are not isolated individuals. They belong to lines of descent, communities, and successive periods. That is real. It is documented, and it is exactly where we need to slow down, because modern genetics gives us a very different vocabulary for inheritance. A gene is not a moral substance. A bloodline is not a single biological switch, and a trait that disappears in one generation and reappears later does not necessarily prove that an ancient writer knew the mechanism behind it. Modern genetics, however, does provide something genuinely interesting. A person receives genetic material from both parents. Recombination reshuffles inherited variants. Some variants can be recessive and therefore remain unexpressed in one generation, while appearing in a later generation when the necessary combination occurs. Other variants can be carried without producing an obvious trait. Sex-linked inheritance can produce additional patterns because certain genes occur on the X or Y chromosomes. This means a characteristic can appear to skip generations. That part is real, but skips generations is not the same thing as the Book of Enoch predicted a hidden gene. The distinction is enormous. A recessive trait can disappear from the visible family record and then reappear. A carrier can pass a variant forward without showing the associated phenotype. A Y chromosome lineage can be traced through paternal lines. Mitochondrial DNA follows a predominantly maternal inheritance path. These are biological mechanisms. They are measurable, they can be tested, and they do not require Enoch to have known modern genetics. Now, here's where the ancient text becomes useful again. Enoch repeatedly thinks in terms of transmission. Something happens. Its consequences spread. Generations inherit the consequences of what came before. That idea is not the same as genetic inheritance, but it is a genuine theme of the material. Here's what the translators left out. The first thing they left out is not a secret sentence. It is the assumption that every modern translation must contain the same wording. It does not. The textual history of First Enoch is complicated because the surviving witnesses exist in different languages and different manuscript traditions. Most of the work was originally composed in Aramaic. Later transmission involved Greek and Ethiopic witnesses, and the complete ancient form preserved today is in Ge'ez. Modern translations must therefore compare different textual witnesses rather than simply copy a single original manuscript. That means differences in wording can be real. But a textual difference is not automatically a cover-up. Sometimes a word is damaged. Sometimes a passage survives only in a fragment. Sometimes one language preserves a nuance, another language handles differently. Sometimes a translator must reconstruct missing material from other witnesses. This is normal ancient text scholarship. It is not proof of deliberate suppression. The suppression starts at the point where ancient communities began deciding which writings would function as authoritative scripture. That process did not happen through one universal order. Different Jewish and Christian communities had different collections. Some texts were read widely without becoming canonical. Others became canonical in one tradition and non-canonical in another. 1 Enoch is the clearest example. It was important enough to circulate widely in antiquity. It was preserved at Qumran. It influenced later religious writers. The New Testament letter of Jude contains language closely related to a passage in 1 Enoch. Yet 1 Enoch did not become part of most later Christian biblical canons. And that is a very different claim from saying someone secretly locked away a genetic discovery. The modern cover-up is where the evidence becomes even weaker. There is no established recent incident in which a government agency denied a permit because researchers were about to reveal an Enochic gene. There is no authenticated missing Enoch manuscript containing a genetic sequence. There is no verified redacted laboratory report showing that researchers discovered an Enoch bloodline mechanism and were ordered to conceal it. Those claims circulate because they fit the structure of a mystery, but fitting the structure of a mystery is not the same as proving the event occurred. Now, here's where it gets active. Modern science has given us technologies that would have been unimaginable to the writers of 1 Enoch. Ancient DNA can recover genetic information from archaeological remains under suitable conditions. Researchers can compare ancient genomes with modern populations. They can identify patterns of ancestry, population movement, mixture, and genetic continuity. Research into ancient human genomes has already demonstrated that populations once thought to be simple and isolated were often mixtures of multiple ancestral groups. Studies of ancient Europeans, for example, have identified ancestry from several deeply differentiated populations rather than one uninterrupted genetic line. And modern researchers can also use genetic markers to follow particular lines. Y chromosomal markers can track paternal ancestry. Mitochondrial markers can track maternal ancestry. Autosomal DNA contains contributions from both sides of the family, but none of those systems produces a universal, every few generations, Enoch gene. Inheritance is probabilistic. Recombination changes the combination. Population structure changes the odds. Variance can become rare. Variance can become common. A family can carry a mutation for generations without an obvious effect. Then one descendant can display it. That can look like a hidden bloodline mechanism even when the explanation is completely ordinary genetics. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that Enoch contains a secret genetic code deliberately concealed by every biblical translator who came after it. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches something much simpler. An ancient culture thinking deeply about descent, reproduction, inherited consequences, and the persistence of human conditions across generations. That is significant, without needing to turn it into molecular biology. And there is another detail worth confronting. The ancient manuscripts themselves are evidence against the idea that Enoch was simply fabricated recently. The Qumran fragments are old. 4Q201 was copied roughly 2 centuries before the Common Era. Other Enoch manuscripts were also recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Oxford scholarship treats the Enochic collection as a major component of Second Temple Jewish literature, composed in multiple stages and preserved through multiple textual witnesses. The existence of those manuscripts does not prove the supernatural claims inside them, but it does prove that the tradition is ancient. And that matters, because the real mystery is not whether an ancient writer secretly understood DNA. The real mystery is why humans have always been so concerned with what survives them: a family name, a physical trait, a pattern of behavior, a reputation, a blessing, a curse, a memory, a biological variant. These things move through generations in different ways. Some are cultural, some are social, some are environmental, some are biological. The mistake is assuming they are all the same kind of inheritance. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If Enoch repeatedly describes generations carrying forward the consequences of earlier generations, then the text is genuinely concerned with inheritance. If modern genetics shows that biological variants can remain hidden in carriers and later become visible, then the apparent skipping of traits has a real scientific explanation. If ancient DNA demonstrates that human populations are mixtures of multiple ancestral lines rather than perfectly isolated bloodlines, then the idea of a simple, uninterrupted lineage becomes difficult to defend. And if the surviving Enoch manuscripts contain no identifiable gene, chromosome, mutation, or reproducible genetic sequence, then the evidence does not justify claiming that Enoch revealed a hidden gene. What remains is more interesting than the sensational version. The Book of Enoch preserves an ancient way of thinking about human descent. It treats generations as connected. It treats actions as having consequences that can reach beyond one lifetime. It describes unusual offspring and damaged boundaries between groups. It places human history inside a much larger structure of order and judgment. Modern genetics gives us another language for certain forms of inheritance, but it does not turn those ancient passages into laboratory reports. That distinction does not weaken the text. It protects it. Because once you stop forcing Enoch to predict DNA, you can actually see what the manuscript is doing. It is asking how much of the past remains inside the present. And that question has not disappeared. Today we can measure inheritance. We can sequence genomes. We can compare ancestors and descendants. We can identify variants that travel through families. We can watch traits disappear from view and return generations later. But none of that requires us to manufacture an ancient gene. The evidence is already strange enough. A text composed in stages more than 2,000 years ago survives in fragments at Qumran. Its oldest witnesses preserve discussions of generations, offspring, corruption, heavenly beings, and judgment. Its complete tradition survives in Ethiopic. Modern scholars reconstruct its wording by comparing multiple languages and manuscript witnesses. And modern genetics independently shows that inheritance can produce patterns that look, from the outside, like traits disappearing and returning. That is where the real connection ends. Not with a secret chromosome, not with a hidden laboratory, with a question: what does it mean for something to pass from one generation to another? The answer depends on what is being passed. DNA can pass biologically. Names pass culturally. Behavior can pass through families. Trauma can have social consequences. Resources can pass economically. Beliefs can pass through teaching. And ancient texts can pass through copying. Enoch itself is proof of that final form of inheritance. One generation copied it, another preserved it, another translated it, another nearly lost access to it. Then fragments emerged from the desert, and now you can read the surviving words again. The small brown fragment is still behind glass. Its surface is still broken. The ink is still pressed into the ancient fibers. It is still there, still carrying marks from another age, still passing something from one generation to the next, exactly as the manuscript itself has done.